Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. My name is Jeremy Nettles. I am the evangelist for the River Ridge Church of Christ in Newburgh, Indiana. We would love to have you get in touch with us with comments or questions or requests for us to address a topic on this program at a future date. You can give us a call or send a text to 812-550-6234. You can also send email to info@riverridgechurch.org. You're also welcome to join us at 5600 Van Road in Newburgh for our 9 a.m. Sunday Bible study and our 10 a.m. worship. We gather again at 4 p.m. on Sundays for another period of worship, and we also have a Wednesday evening Bible study at 7. You're welcome to join us for any and all of those. Anyone who is at all familiar with me and my work knows that I like to do series. And one of the series that I have been working on for quite a long time is a series looking at the entire Bible. And we started by looking at the whole thing in just one shot, the whole Bible in half an hour. And then we zoomed in a little and we looked at the Old Testament and we looked at the New Testament. We actually looked at the Apocrypha one week. And finally, we have gotten to the point of looking at one book at a time, or in the case of, as we did last week on the program, we looked at Thessalonians, the two letters that Paul wrote to the church at Thessalonica together. Our next installment for today is the book of Judges. This is the second book in the history section of the Old Testament, and it begins with the phrase, "after the death of Joshua." So you might remember quite a while back we looked at the book of Joshua, and we talked about what God was accomplishing for his people Israel and through his people Israel at that time, and they were led by God's prophet, who was named Joshua. But of course, he was not going to live forever, and eventually he died, and the reins had to pass to somebody else. But it got a little messy. You see, before Moses was leading the Israelites, they didn't really have a leader. They were a bunch of slaves in Egypt. So Moses was their first leader. He led them for 40 years, and when he died, there was a ready replacement, already hand-selected by God as well as Moses, in Joshua. Joshua took over, and he led them for quite a long time as well, but eventually he died, and, well, there wasn't really any direct replacement for him. Now, on the bright side, God had given them the promised land. Throughout the book of Joshua, they went through, and they didn't always do it to its fullest extent, and they didn't always obey God's instructions, but they did, for the most part, take possession of that land that he had given to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and promised to their descendants forever. Aside from some stragglers and some mistakes in some areas where they didn't quite want to pursue the Philistines all the way out of the promised land, they pretty much had control of the whole deal. But as long as we're in chapter 1 of Judges, you can see a list beginning in verse 27 of all the people they did not succeed in driving out. Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Bethshean and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, etc. And it's not only Manasseh who failed in this. Several of the tribes failed to one extent or another, and to top it all off, as God predicted was going to happen, as he warned them sternly throughout Deuteronomy and before, if they didn't drive out the inhabitants of the land completely, then they were going to be influenced by them. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them, and bowed down to them. And they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. This is turning into a series of mistakes on the part of the Israelites, and God is understandably very displeased with what they have done. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers, who plundered them. And he sold them into the hand of their surrounding enemies, so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned, and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were in terrible distress. He told them over and over this was going to happen. Most recently, he had predicted it in Deuteronomy several times over, and at great length. He told them, if you will be faithful to me and do as I tell you, then things are going to be great for you. If you disobey, and especially if you go after the idols of the people that you're supposed to drive out of this land, then, well, I'm going to become your enemy rather than your friend. So that's exactly what happened, but eventually the Israelites start to cry out to God and ask him to rescue them from their distress. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them. So just like God did with Moses when the Israelites were in slavery in Egypt and they cried out for salvation, well, he raised up a prophet and a leader to take care of them and to drive off their oppressors, or to, in that case, rescue them from the hands of their oppressors and lead them out into the wilderness. Well, he does this now in the Promised Land through the hands of the judges whom he appoints. Well, that sounds pretty good, right? Verse 17. Yet they did not listen to their judges, for they whored after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their fathers had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord, and they did not do so. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who afflicted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they turned back and were more corrupt than their fathers, going after other gods, serving them and bowing down to them. They did not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways. So God had instituted a plan and had executed it through the Israelites and through his servant Joshua. He had driven out the inhabitants of the land that he had promised to give to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and to their descendants forever. Everything was going so well, God kept up his end of the bargain to the letter. The people of Israel are the ones who messed things up by rejecting him and by trying to fit in with the people who were left around them, and by worshiping their gods. They angered the God of heaven. What we have read here in mostly chapter 2 of the book of Judges is a great summarization of the book as a whole. There were 12 sort of canonical judges. They would be Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, Gideon, Tola, Jer, Jephthah, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, and Samson. There are a couple others later, Eli and Samuel, who are mentioned in the book of 1 Samuel, and they're both called judges there, but they're not part of the book that's called by the name Judges. There's also a guy in the middle of the book named Abimelech that is sometimes included among the judges, but he's not really one. He's a usurper. They're not necessarily chronological completely. They're told in roughly chronological order, but each judge is not over the entire nation of Israel necessarily. For the most part, they are sort of regional phenomena. That period is going to come to a close after Samuel's time as a judge, or I guess toward the end of his time as a judge, because Samuel is the one who appoints the first king over Israel, King Saul. He does this despite his own and God's protests, because it's the will of the people. They want a king to rule over them, and there are a lot of bad things that come along with that, because, well, now they're subservient and they're, in a sense, enslaved to that king. But it also brings some good things. It brings a sense of cohesion and a sense of order and the ability to put on a collected response to these sorts of outside military threats. God allowed the Israelites to basically experiment with a very libertarian, almost anarchic society that was ruled solely by his laws. And that was supposed to be a wonderful gift for them, but they proved that they were not willing to deal with their own freedom, and that they would rather be slaves to their own desires and their own passions. And so they end up with a king who takes away a lot of that freedom to impose order from above. So that's kind of a general overall look at the book of Judges and the period in which it's happening and the political climate in which the events take place. But let's take a little while and look at each judge in succession, at least what we know of them. In chapter 3, we meet the first judge named Othniel, and we can read his entire section pretty quickly. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Asheroth. Therefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia. And the people of Israel served Cushan-Rishathaim 8 years. But when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for the people of Israel, who saved them, Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. The Spirit of the Lord was upon him, and he judged Israel. He went out to war, and the Lord gave Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand. And his hand prevailed over Cushan-Rishathaim, so the land had rest 40 years. Then Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. Well, that's pretty cut and dry. God appointed a judge, and the judge took care of business, and he kicked out the usurper, and they ended up in a much better state, and they had peace for 40 years. That's nice, I suppose. But we don't really get any details about Othniel and his methods or the particular way that he dealt with this threat of Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia. The next judge gives us a little bit more detail. After those 40 years of rest, well, big surprise, the Israelites started serving the idols again, and so God allowed the Moabites to begin oppressing them. Well, chapter 3, verse 15, the people of Israel cry out to the Lord again, as they always do when they're in trouble, and God raises up for them a new judge, who is named Ehud. Now, Ehud, well, let's just read verse 16. And Ehud made for himself a sword with 2 edges, a cubit in length, and he bound it on his right thigh under his clothes. The story that follows for the rest of chapter 3 is entertaining and slightly disgusting, but it amounts to Ehud's assassination of the Moabite king. He gets away with it. It's almost like a James Bond scene. He gets away with it scot-free and walks away before the Moabites have any idea what has happened. Ehud goes back and reports what he has done, and all of the Israelite men of war pretty much go, all right, we're following him. They beat back the Moabite oppressors into their own territory, and, verse 30, the land had rest for 80 years. The next judge, Shamgar, is extremely entertaining. It's a very, very good story. Chapter 3, verse 31. After him was Shamgar the son of Anath, who killed 600 of the Philistines with an ox goad, and he also saved Israel. That's about it. That's the whole thing. We don't know anything else about Shamgar. It's left completely up to our imagination exactly what brought it about that he needed to kill 600 Philistines with an ox goad of all things. But there you have it. Following Shamgar in chapter 4, we see Deborah and Barak. Deborah seems to be the judge in this story, but Barak is the military leader, and it's kind of hard to separate the two. In Hebrews chapter 11, as the author there lists a whole bunch of sort of heroes because of their faith, in the middle of a list of judges, he says, "What more shall I say, for time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah." Gideon, Samson, and Jephthah are all judges in the canonical list of judges in the book of Judges, and instead of Deborah, he mentions Barak. Well, at any rate, in Judges 4, verse 4, it says, "Now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at that time." A group of Canaanites is oppressing Israel at present, and Deborah ends up as sort of a wake-up call for the nation's men. She tells Barak, whom I mentioned before, he's the captain of the Israelites' army, that God expects him to go and fight the Canaanites, and God will be with him, and he responds in verse 8, "If you will go with me, I will go, but if you will not go with me, I will not go." And she said, "I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman." You can see how gender roles and gender dynamics are at play here. Here is a man, a captain of the army, being told, "Go do your job," and he says, "I'm afraid to go unless this woman, who's clearly not a man of war and doesn't belong on the battlefield, goes with me." And she says, "Fine, I will. I have the chutzpah to do it," you might say, but at the same time, know that you're not going to get any glory because of your sheepish attitude, I suppose, about it. Now, when she says that Sisera is going to be sold into the hand of a woman, she doesn't actually mean herself. That is, well, if you want to read more about that, then read the rest of chapter 4 of the book of Judges. It's pretty entertaining. Chapters 6 through 8 cover the next judge, Gideon. Several events in Gideon's judgeship are related to us. One of them is actually not about the oppressors at all. It's about his own people who are serving the Baals. And God tells him to tear down the statue of Baal, and he does it. Great. That gets him into a little bit of trouble with his fellow Israelites who are worshiping these idols at the time, but they end up following him, and he ends up leading a raid against the Midianites who are oppressing them at the time, and defeating them, sending them packing. You're probably familiar with Gideon's 300 men. Well, this is that story, and you can read about it in Judges chapter 7. He continues to pursue the Midianite kings in chapter 8, and eventually finds and kills them too. There's a lot of good stuff about Gideon, a lot of good qualities in him. He's not perfect, of course, but you can understand why Gideon is one of the names that every once in a while gets used even today. But there are also some big problems. In chapter 8, beginning in verse 22, we read, "Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, 'Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian.' Gideon said to them, 'I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you.'" That's fantastic. This is a situation like Cincinnatus or like George Washington in our own history, where he was basically given the opportunity to become the king. Everybody would have followed him. They wanted him to be king, and he said, "No. I'm not taking that power. It's not mine to take. That's what Gideon does. He says, I'm not going to rule over you. God is your king. Respect him, obey him. Fantastic. And then things get weird. And Gideon said to them, let me make a request of you. Every one of you give me the earrings from his spoil, for they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. And they answered, we will willingly give them. And they spread out a cloak, and every man threw in it the earrings of his spoil. And the weight of the golden earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides the crescent ornaments and the pendants and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, and besides the collars that were around the necks of their camels. And Gideon made an ephod of it, and put it in his city in Ophrah. And all Israel whored after it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and to his family. Hold up now, what's an ephod, and why are they whoring after it? Well, it's a quasi-religious statuary icon of some sort. It's almost synonymous with idol. And so you can see why it became an object of some concern. People started worshiping this as a representation of God. Isn't there like a commandment about that or something? Well, at any rate, Gideon, who started out as the guy who tore down the idols and reminded the people that they worship the God of heaven, who cannot be represented by anything made of wood or stone or gold, ends up sort of half-accidentally creating one of his own. Oops. But that's not the end of Gideon's story. Even though he's dead and gone by this point, the people still aren't willing to give up on their plans to have him be their ruler and to have his son be their ruler after him. One of his sons, he had quite a few, is named Abimelech. My Hebrew is not fantastic, but that would mean something like, my father is king. Anyway, he is one of 70 sons belonging to Gideon, which does not suggest that Gideon was entirely monogamous, but anyway, Abimelech decides that he wants to take charge, and he succeeds in taking charge of a significant portion of the Israelite nation. Say in the ears of all the leaders of Shechem, which is better for you, that 70 of the sons of Jerubbaal rule over you, or that one rule over you? Remember also that I am your bone and your flesh. And his mother's relatives spoke all these words on his behalf in the ears of all the leaders of Shechem, and their hearts inclined to follow Abimelech. For they said, he is our brother. Jerubbaal is another name for Gideon, by the way. Well, he takes this help from the people of Shechem and immediately gets busy eliminating the competition. Verse 5. And he went to his father's house at Ophrah and killed his brothers, the sons of Jerubbaal, 70 men on one stone. But Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, was left, for he hid himself. Well, in a way, Jotham turns out to be the downfall of Abimelech. After Abimelech, there arose to save Israel Tola, the son of Puah, son of Dodo, a man of Issachar, and he lived at Shamir in the hill country of Ephraim. And he judged Israel 23 years. Then he died and was buried at Shamir. Tola gets about as much focus as Shamgar, and Jer following Tola is exactly the same. There's a more extended story about the next judge named Jephthah in chapter 11 and 12, but well, first of all, I've gone into a fair amount of detail on a previous installment of this TV program. Just go to our YouTube channel and search Jephthah if you're interested to find that, and you can get more of the details of that story. Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon get about as much information told about them as Shamgar and Tola and Jer did, which is to say almost none at all. And then finally, we get to chapter 13, and we introduce Samson. Samson is the topic of chapter 13, and chapter 14, and chapter 15, and chapter 16. He gets more text than any of the other judges. And his story is, well, it's certainly more entertaining than the stories of the other judges. Samson is a complicated character. There are a lot of good things about him. For example, we read about him in chapter 13, verse 25, and the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him in Mahaneh Dan between Zorah and Eshtaol. So from the time that he is a young man, the Spirit of the Lord is on him, and it is stirring him. And we don't know exactly how that looks or exactly what the Spirit of the Lord was stirring him to do, or in what way he was stirring him. But, well, he's going to work things out such that Samson rescues the Israelites from the hands of the Philistines who have been oppressing them. Samson tears a lion to bits with his bare hands in chapter 14. Samson lights the Philistines' fields on fire in chapter 15. Chapter 15 is also the source of a phrase that I'm sure you have heard before, the jawbone of an ass. That would be the implement that Samson used to kill about 1,000 Philistines. Then, of course, there is the failed romance of Samson and Delilah in chapter 16. Delilah convinces him to tell her the secret of his strength, and to be clear, it really wasn't all about his hair, but that was like the last remaining vestige of his dedication to God. And when he gives that up and tells her, yeah, go ahead and cut my hair, well, you can understand why God abandoned him and took away his supernatural strength at that time as well. Samson ends up a prisoner of the Philistines with a shaved head and no eyeballs, but he has some time to reflect while he is imprisoned, and when they bring him out to taunt him and to gloat over the fact that they have the Israelites' champion and strong man in their clutches, by that point he realizes, A, they're not just mocking me, they are mocking the Lord, and B, my great strength came from the Lord, and if he wants, he can give it back to me. And C, he pretty much figures, if I had my way, I would tear this whole building down. He prays to God for strength, and God gives it to him. Samson dies in the collapse of that building, vindicating the Lord God Almighty in the eyes of the Philistines in the process. And then there's chapters 17 and 18 and 19 and 20 and 21, and you might be thinking, what in the world do these have to do with it? We've already been through the 12 judges. Samson was the last one, and then we've got several chapters at the end that don't mention any judges at all. In fact, they're just some weird stories about weird people doing weird things that don't seem particularly Jewish. There's idolatry, there's some weird shrine making, there are war crimes, there's, well, basically a repeat of Sodom and Gomorrah within the boundaries of Israel and their nation. There's civil war between one tribe and all the others, basically a genocide of the Benjaminites. And then they come to their senses and they go, what have we done? We have basically wiped out the tribe of Benjamin, and there's no way that they're going to be able to rebuild. I've got an idea. Why don't we allow the Benjaminites to take whoever they want as wives, basically just rape these poor women, and use that as a means of perpetuating their tribe? This is some really awful stuff. What is going on here? They're some of the roughest chapters in the whole Bible. Here's what's going on. There's a phrase that gets repeated. Chapter 17, verse 6. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Chapter 18, verse 1. In those days there was no king in Israel. Chapter 19, verse 1. In those days when there was no king in Israel. And finally, chapter 21, verse 25. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. It's not even completely clear that this is all chronologically taking place after Samson. The timeline's not what's important, it's the events in question. And there were some horrible, horrible things being done in the borders of Israel. And the suggestion here is that it was in part because there was no king. And so, what were people doing? What was right in their own eyes. And as we read at the beginning of the book a couple of times, what was right in their eyes was evil in the sight of the Lord. During the period of Judges, with the freedom that God had given them, they showed themselves incapable of handling that freedom. They did what was right in their own eyes, and they didn't allow the Lord to be their true king. They decided to reign over themselves. They decided that each of them was going to be his own king, and that they were just going to fight it out and take what they wanted in every way possible. Monetarily, property-wise, sexually. And ultimately, I think that is the lesson that we need to take away from Judges today. We live in a country that has a substantial amount of freedom associated with it. I like it when people don't intrude in my life. I like freedom. You probably do too. But are we capable of managing our freedom? The thing is, we're not ever actually completely free. A lot of people like to think that they are, and we hold freedom as the highest good so often. But as we hold up freedom, we also beg for restrictions. We beg for the government to step in and keep, well, usually those people from doing what I don't want them to do. So I want freedom for me, but not for you. That's different. I want you to be under my control. And, well, that's what the Israelites were doing, isn't it? Okay, not everybody's like that. Not everybody is actually trying to go out and take charge of other people and tell them what to do. Some people are totally content to say, you do you and I'll do me, and what we can get along, just don't worry about what I'm doing and I won't worry about what you're doing. You can be off there doing some things that I find horribly repugnant, but I'm not going to say anything as long as you don't say anything about what I'm doing. Does that work out very well? I'll tell you how that works out. It works out with skyrocketing crime rates, escalating homelessness, and a drug epidemic that is just disgustingly enormous. In my age group, do you know what the number one killer was in the year 2020? It wasn't COVID, it was fentanyl overdoses. Does it sound like we are doing a very good job at managing our freedom? It sounds to me like in professing to be free, we have made ourselves slaves to our most basic desires, which is to say, slaves of sin and slaves of death and slaves of Satan. Everybody is a slave to someone or something. All we get to do is choose our master. You can choose God as your master. You can let the Lord rule over you. You can choose to obey his rules even when you don't like them. Or you can reject his rule, or you can say that he's your master, but when you don't like his rules, disobey. If that's the case, then you're not really serving him. He's not really your king. If that's your mentality, then you're really just professing to serve yourself. And as we have just noted, how does that turn out? You don't end up in charge of anything. You end up enslaved to your own physical desires. Hardly anybody out there is actively professing, yes, I serve Satan, but plenty of people say, I serve nobody. I choose not to serve anyone. And as we have established, everybody serves someone or something. Matthew chapter 12, verse 30, whoever is not with me is against me, and whoever does not gather with me scatters. That's Jesus, folks. You're either with him or you're against him. Are you on his side? Really? When push comes to shove, do you obey him or your own desires? Who's really in charge? Do you have the freedom from sin, the freedom to do as you ought to do, or do you just have the freedom from an oppressive ruler like the Israelites did that led to all sorts of disaster and despair in their lives? If you would like to change that, then we at River Ridge would love to help you do so. It's not that we're the gatekeepers, we're just a community of people who have decided that we are going to serve the Lord, and we believe that the Bible tells us exactly how to do so. We would love to help you study it further and help you to understand God's will for you better, God's will for all mankind. You're welcome to join us at 5600 Van Road in Newburgh at 10 a.m. for Sunday worship or 4 p.m. for afternoon worship. You can also find us there at 9 a.m. on Sundays for Bible study and at 7 p.m. on Wednesdays for another study. If you're not able to do either of those, then please give us a call at 812-550-6234 or send a text to that same number. We can also correspond over email at info@riverridgechurch.org. We can set you up with a correspondence course by mail. We can do studies over Zoom or in person if you're local to the Evansville area. We want to help you with this spiritual struggle to serve the right master. Please get in touch with us, and please join me again on Iron Sharpens Iron.